Hello, everybody. We have a Road to 2100 rapid game that I just played. Really crazy, very tough game, um, but it was overall pretty smooth as far as us maintaining the edge and not really blundering our position, thankfully. But it was still hard fought from our opponent, August Olira. He was rated 1999, but we're blocking him out of the 2000 club. We have enough Brazilians. We met our quota. You got to stay in the 1900s. So anyway, let's go to the game. He opens up with d4. Oh, by the way, if you're lower rated, less than 1,000, you might want to skip the Road to 2100 series. You might want to just stick with the speed run. Some of the concepts and stuff may either confuse you or even have negative consequences on your chess because plenty of times I end up breaking certain principles or making confusing moves that you just may not understand. So, but for anyone, let's say 1300 and up or so, and ideally 1700 up, they'll get the most out of this. Anyway, he goes d4. You can respond a number of ways, of course, but I like to play knight to f6. It's flexible and it gives white options. They can go into d4 c4 queen's gambit decline style structure, or they can maybe go for the London. At the lower ratings, you're going to face the London all the time. As you get to like 1800, 2000 plus, you're going to face d4 more and more. But as you see here, this guy's 2000 basically, and he's still playing with the London. Fine. So there's many ways you can meet the London. Lots of different systems and lines. You can just play principled according to the principles, and you should have an equal, perfectly playable position as black. I like to go c5. It's a sharper way to play. d5 is much more solid as the pawns simply block each other but cannot take each other, so that there's not actual tension because pawns capture diagonally. But with c5, it's immediate tension, and white immediately can take, he can push, he can defend, um, and it gives him choices. And so I like to do this. It gives him options to go wrong. Um, Objectively, probably e3 is the way to play. White goes c3, and this is a very common way people defend this pawn. You should definitely defend it with a pawn and not a piece. That's extremely important if you play the London. So he defends it with a pawn. Fine. This doesn't threaten anything, but it does open the queen, defends the pawn. What's the drawback? It weakens these two light squares a little bit. It also takes away that square from his knight. Fine. Now, one of the drawbacks of the London in general is the bishop moves out on move 2, which means that as early as move 2, you're weakening the b2 square. So the way I play against the London, which you do not have to do this, there's plenty of ways to play, and this is definitely a sharper, riskier way to play, is queen b6. Now, queen b6 develops the queen instead of a minor piece or playing d5, so it's not as normal of a move. However, it develops a move for free because it comes with a threat on the b2 pawn. Now, you do not always want to take a b2 pawn. B pawns in general are just very poisonous. They waste a lot of time to capture, but if you happen to know the line and you're comfortable with it, you can do it. Anyway, this pawn's under attack. The ways to defend: queen c2, queen b3. Those are the general ways of defending. White goes queen b3, offering the queen trade. So now I see that, by the way, like I always mention, you have to know when you're in theory and when you're not in theory. Currently, I'm in theory, so I know queen c2 and queen b3 is what he should, he should pick from those two, let's say. He picks this one, offers the queen trade. I know that I can take and he can recapture, right? and then I can take the center pawn, and if he recaptures, he's going to have a b pawn on b2, a b pawn on b3, and they're going to be doubled and isolated, and his king side development is non-existent. So I trade the queens. And I know that this is fine for black. I like it because of what I just mentioned. Double isolated pawns, no development here. And so he takes, and now I take the pawn because I want to lure this away and create these big weaknesses. And it's not just the pawns that are weak, it's the squares in front of them. So a bishop, planted here, or a knight planted here can never really be kicked. It's just a good outpost. It's annoying for white. But then white kind of surprised me and took the knight. Like, as far as I know, based on what I've learned, I guess, from watching videos, I only know white capturing the pawn, right? So like what I know is white taking here, and then I develop my knight, attacking that pawn and staring at the b4 square. He can't push because it's captured, and it becomes very annoying for white. But he didn't go down that line. So as of now, move 6, right? So I guess this is his move 6. So at the end of move 5, I'm out of book. I'm out of theory. I only got to 5 moves of opening theory, which is still a decent amount to get you on the road. But now I'm out of book. So what do? No, I don't have any more computers helping me, right? I have to think for myself. So I don't even know this move. So I have to figure, okay, is there something just like blatantly wrong with it? Is it just straight up a blunder? So I'm like, okay, the obvious move is take the bishop, duh. But I'm just thinking, is there, since this isn't a move I know, is there something crazy like d takes c? So I'm calculating, okay, I take a pawn, he retreats his bishop. Can you take or push, something weird like that? I don't think it works, because if you take a pawn and he retreats, if you push, he can move his knight and he's defending. And if you take, he could just move the rook and you didn't get your piece back. I'm pretty sure that's correct. I'm not verifying that with the engine, but so anyway, I looked at that so you know how I'm thinking in the order that I'm thinking. And then I just take the bishop because I deem that this doesn't work. And I realize this is hanging, but what are you going to do? So he takes this pawn, and I was like, that can't be that good. Why? Well, it kind of looks good because he's bringing his rook down into my territory. However, that rook is technically stuck there, as in I have a pawn on b7. So his rook doesn't have access, period. End of story. And he can't do anything about this pawn because his army is completely unmoved, right? And this, most importantly, it wastes a lot of time. And what happens when you waste time is I get to play in the center. So, for example, I have a central pawn hanging right now that he could take instead of this pawn, but he doesn't. And because of that, because he takes the wrong pawn, that now gives me the opportunity to save my central pawn. And if I can save my central pawn, it may be very, very strong because it's a central pawn on his half of the board. So I said, okay, what's the threat? He took this, and now my pawn's hanging. I said, okay, maybe I can leave it hanging and make a powerful developing move, but my bishop can't move. My bishop can't move. My rook wants to stay here anyway for the time being. I have to make a pawn move. Fine. What's the most powerful pawn move I can make? Well, one that gives my bishop some scope. You could try something like g6, but it doesn't look so powerful, right? You can fianchetto, but it's slow. The pawn doesn't control the center. So I decide that I want to put a pawn in the center, open up one of my bishops, and I might as well defend the pawn at the same time. e5. It meets all the criteria. Now we have 2 pawns in the center. We open up our bishop, and we protect our pawn. We're now starting to build up the power of our position. White develops a piece, and white played very well for the most part, so it wasn't easy to break down. But once I have this center, it becomes a lot easier for me to play and a lot harder for white to play, because he always has to worry about things like me pushing, and all the space and control I have of the center. So he develops the knight. What is the threat? This pawn is threatened as well as this pawn, because if takes, takes, takes. So both of these are threatened. It helps him castle, clearly a great move. And most importantly, it doesn't walk into e4 because the knight can take the pawn. If it did walk into e4, let's say this pawn was defended by another pawn or something, and I could play e4, that would be terrible for him, having to move his knight into a bad location. But that's currently not the case. So now I'm saying, okay, these pawns are hanging. What the heck can I do here? It's kind of tricky because if you just play d6 defending this pawn, he'll just capture the other pawn and win that. Now, I was like, okay, if I lose this pawn, I don't really mind. I'm going to have great development. I'm going to have open lines, the bishop pair. I'll have a decent game, whatever. But I'm like, I don't want to lose it if I don't have to lose it, right? So I was thinking, how can you defend both in one move? And I find the best move, bishop c5. What does this do? Well, it defends the pawn for free because it's a forcing move hitting the rook. Now I calculated in my head, if the rook attacks the bishop trying to get the turn back, like let's say I move the bishop away, it's his turn again. I knew there I would have at the very least have b6 protecting and attacking, so it's another tempo move. I get the turn back, right? So we would be fighting for turns. I knew he couldn't do that. I played bishop c5. I know he has to move the rook, which would give me another turn to protect the other pawn. That's why this works. So he moves the rook back to its starting square. Don't be afraid to move pieces back to their at least long range pieces. Knights are different, but don't be afraid to move long range pieces back to their starting squares. Oftentimes their home squares are extremely powerful. So he goes back. Now what does this threaten? My central pawn. That's the threat. Okay, I don't want to lose this pawn because it's part of this whole structure, right? And I want to keep this structure so I can maintain my control of the center, which is my advantage, along with my bishop pair. So I play the natural move d6. This defends the pawn with the pawn, and just as importantly, another thing I wanted to accomplish is opening my bishop, right? I wanted to develop. This move immediately controls a ton of squares. Notice at all times I'm considering this push, which never works because he takes, and this capture, which you can always play and it's always fine for you, but I don't want to voluntarily develop his knight or voluntarily fix his pawn structure unless I have a concrete follow-up, which and I actually considered, I don't know if this is what the engine wants, but I was considering maybe it was here, something like takes. Maybe was it here? I don't know if it was. I don't know if it was here. No, I think his knight might have been developed. So it was like takes, takes. You know, knight in here. How does he defend this pawn? You know, if you can take and then create unstoppable threats, that's fine. But I don't want to just trade, right? So I don't know what the engine has in the mind, but d6 for me makes perfect sense and develops. Okay, so now he goes here. What does this threaten? Well, he has access to the c4 square, which doesn't actually do anything. Like if he, let's say he jumped it in now, we would go b5, he has to run away. So, okay, but he still has a square. It also controls the e4 square, which it would have been nice if I can jump into for free, which I now can't. Okay, it tries to develop. The drawback doesn't defend this pawn, so now if I take, he doesn't get to develop. He has to capture with the pawn. Another drawback, I don't know, that's pretty good. So now you could do a bunch of things, anywhere from development to considering these pawn pushes. You know, at any point, these pushes are always considerations, and every turn you have to look at them, and it takes so much time. So I just quickly castle because I want to save time because I'm down 3 minutes. This guy has more time than he started with. But at this point in time, I already really like my position because if you look at the center, I have 2 pawns, he has none. I have another pawn protecting, pieces touching. I'm fully castled. He's not castled. He has no pawns in the center. So even though it's playable for white, it's, from my perspective, very hard to play because you're going to need to play perfect moves. Like if I don't play perfect moves, the bar will go, my advantage will go here and there. But if he doesn't play a perfect move, he's just going to lose. So it's very hard for white. So anyway, I castle. Makes perfect sense. I'm ready to get my rook in the game. My king is safe. So here's the thing. He needs to develop his bishop. But if he moves his e-pawn, I just take it. And then when he takes back, I win the pawn. So he probably wanted to play e3 or e4, but he doesn't want to lose the pawn, so he decides to go the other way. I'm not afraid of this. I'm like, you have moves here. You can develop the bishop, right? Again, maybe you can take or push some pawns. Like always, if you push this hangs. So I was waiting for the right moment to push it. I was always looking at this to try to like create a wedge pawn in his position, but was never completely sure about it. So I just developed my rook. I did consider moving my bishop out, and if I go here and he kicks it, and I go back and he kicks it, and I go here and he goes knight h5. I mean, there's no queens on the board, so the weaknesses aren't as big a deal. I'm like, I don't feel like letting him hunt my bishop down. There's no need for any of that. Let me just increase the power of my position. I bring a rook into the game, and now this rook supports this pawn, which is something I had in my mind because various times I was considering pushing this pawn to control these beautiful squares and dominate his knight. But it undefends this pawn, which is attacked. So now the rook defends it, giving me the freedom to push. Now, whether you want to push or not is extremely debatable because this structure is extremely solid. Everything protects everything. These holes are perfect for your pieces. However, if you push, you're controlling mega squares, you support piece jumps, you support pawn pushes. So arguments can be made for both sides. I don't know the truth. Anyway, he fianchettos the logical next move of his position. And so in this position, it's like, what the heck is this position? What's happening? What do I do? Again, you can't push, pawn hangs. You can take, but unless you have a concrete calculation follow-up, don't do it. You might as well keep this pawn here. Notice if he ever takes and you take back with the pawn, yeah, you have double isolated, but he also has double isolated, and yours are actually pretty good compared to his. Your rook is open, the center's open. You have this for your bishop. These pawns are protected by your bishop. It's not bad at all. But I choose now to go d5. I say, okay, you know what? I'm going to make this move. It might be a bad move. It's not a bad move, but in my head, I'm like, I couldn't debate whether it was strong or just like a positional mistake. It seems to be on the strong side as opposed to a mistake, which is nice. Now I have 3 pawns in the center out of the 4. I have to be better, and even like I have to be preferable. Who would want to be white here? That's what I want to know. Like, who's gonna pick white? Not me. So now he castles and says it's a blunder, but it's a very natural move connecting the rooks. It looks perfectly logical. There is a specific sequence the engine points out to get a nice advantage, which involves this wedge pawn. So like, what did they want? They basically just wanted me to push these pawns and create one here, one here, one here. And it's just like in his face pawns. But I didn't do that. I just did the natural move, develop my bishop. But now you can't do the whole sequence. If you want to see the sequence, I mean, let's just show it. So we take the pawn, he takes the pawn, and then I think they wanted push. And then when he moves his knight, which is the reason I didn't go down this line, they want you to push again, which is like a concept, a theme I know. But the thing is, he doesn't have to take. I thought maybe he could just do what they do in those other openings and, just move the knight. But I didn't calculate any further. If you keep calculating, when you take this pawn and he takes back, you have things like knight in. I didn't go down anywhere near this. Like I didn't go that far. So developing your bishop is perfectly like the next best move is to develop your bishop if you don't find that sequence. So I develop it. They don't really care where you develop it. And now he does this move, and when he made it, it looked super weird to me because I'm like, what the heck does this move do? I mean, obviously it attacks the bishop, but I'm not gonna let him take that, right? B5, strong move, just cuts off the connection. Bishop B6, strong move, making the rook go somewhere. B6, protecting and attacking. Like this move just looked so weird. And so I was deciding, do I want to go B5? It's a move that I was thinking about at some points in the game, but I decided to play in the center instead. Or do I go B6? The downside of B6 is it takes away the retreat squares from my bishop. B5 makes the rook look dumb and keeps the retreat squares. I went with B6, which is a perfectly acceptable move. You can ignore engine remarks. And then he goes here, which again, I don't understand these moves. Like, it's clearly defended twice. Even if you kick the bishop, it's still defended. Like, what's your rook doing here? It's now on light squares, attackable by my bishop. So now if I play, like, let's say D3, you can't take because of the fork. And if you're forced to push, now I have a wedge pawn that I can support with E4, and that just looks completely devastating. Wait, did I play? Why didn't I play D3? What did I play? I don't know about that, but yeah, I mean, now it's obvious to me D3 is just super strong, but yeah, because if he goes past, you just go here, and this is a passed pawn, protected passed pawn. That's super strong. So just to show you, like D3 pushes, boom. Now his knight has to move, I don't know, let's say center or something, and this pawn construction is pretty solid. I mean, he should try to break it down, but pretty good. Okay, but I didn't do that. What did I do? Oh yeah, H5. I mean, I do like D3 better. I don't hate H5. The point of my H5 was twofold. One, if he ever hunts the bishop, you have a retreat square. I guess it's threefold. Two, it looked for the king for the future, no back rank junk. And three, if he moves his knight, or maybe even if he doesn't in some circumstances, I can push H4 and mess with him. And maybe even H3 given the circumstance. So that was the logic behind it, because I do want to play in the center, but I still didn't want to take. I like this cluster of pawns. I didn't want to push because he has this. And this, I'm not sure why I didn't do. It looks fine to me now. But anyway, H5, again, not anything bad. Still black is preferable, blah, blah, blah. And then he hits me with this, which I completely forgot about for some reason. Like I knew about it beforehand. Then a second later, I forgot. But it was not a big deal. I figured I'm going to move the bishop somewhere, and the b pawn's defended. All he can do is take the d pawn, and he probably thought, and this is probably one of the most instructive points for 1700 or 1500 up. Pay very close attention to what happens right here. My bishop is hit, right? It's defending this. He's attacking it twice. I'm defending it twice, but if I move the bishop, only once it's hanging. So I move my bishop out of the way because you can't leave it hanging. Now notice, white in his calculation is thinking, he takes the pawn, I take the pawn, he takes the pawn, and he's better. But that's not what happened. He takes the pawn. Now, when you're in this position, you need to 100% understand what you're looking at. Forget about just counting points. That has nothing to do with anything. If you take this pawn because you say, oh, I don't want to be down a pawn, white will immediately be better. His knight has a beautiful outpost that can't be attacked by a pawn. With tempo, bishop's open, another square for the knight, and he's instantly better. All because you wanted to get your pawn back. So I did not do that. I noticed that this pawn, we don't want to take it. We want it there. Why would we want this pawn there? Because that takes away the square from his knights. His knights would love to go here, and this knight would love to go knight b3 and occupy that square. But I said, no way, Jose. You can keep the pawn e4. Boom. Now his knight can't jump in the center, right? In all the other lines I was considering e4, he could always put it there. Now he can't, right? This knight, where's that guy going? Even if he gets here, he has no jumps. Completely stuck. This knight that I just hit, where's it going? He probably should go to knight e5, another very instructive point, which I'm not even sure I fully appreciate. Let me show you. He should probably go knight e5 because his knight doesn't have any good squares, right? And now you might be thinking, let's say, as an intermediate player, can I just take the knight? And when he takes, I win a pawn. Yes, you win the pawn, but it's the same concept as before. We don't want that pawn to move because now this terrible knight suddenly has knight b3, knight d4, beautiful outpost, blockading outposts, and now it's putting in a ton of work. Just to get your pawn back, you don't want that. Also, you don't want to give up a bishop for no reason. So you leave that pawn there. But he did not jump his knight into the center because he probably figured, oh, I'm losing a pawn, right? He's sticking to that material mindset. So instead, he goes knight h4. And I said, well, this can't be right because it looks kind of trapped. So I looked. I said, okay, where can it go? It's hitting my bishop. But if I just move my bishop, I don't know, anywhere, his knight is technically trapped. But if I just move my bishop anywhere, then it's his turn. And he can, I don't know, just as an example, bishop h1. And now his knight has a square. So we don't want to give him the turn back and give him time to free his knight. So we immediately go bishop c8 because it's a free move on the rook. Because we want the turn back, right? Now his rook can't counterattack us, giving him the turn back, right? There's nothing to attack. So he has to go somewhere, but now it's our turn. Why did we want the turn back? So we can play g5. This traps the knight. So now we're up a piece. Move 19, it took us a lot of work. We had to be patient in the center. But if you look visually at the center, you can see that you'd much rather be us, be black, with the two pawns far advanced, the bishop over here, beautiful. Even this bishop, which is on the back rank, is strong, right? Even potentially the other diagonal can use. It's a good bishop. But his knight's trapped. He has to go somewhere. He figures, let me get a second pawn for it. You have to take because you want the piece. He recaptures and solves the problem of his worst placed piece, right? He now moves the knight. And okay, so here, what's the story? Well, he's up 3 minutes. That's not good for me. I'm up a piece, but he has 2 pawns for the piece, and 2 pawns is not nothing. As well as, in order to win that pawn, I had to go g5, which is weakening towards my king, but there's no queens on the board, so no big deal. He's attacking this pawn. There's no point in defending it backwards. Defending it forwards is possible, but else then it kind of cuts off your rook's threat. I said, why do any of that? I'd rather make a forcing move. I'm going to go g4 for free, right? Kicking his knight, he doesn't have good squares again. So if he jumps forward, the funny thing about that is it's trapped again, right? So, but it entices him to go forward because where else, are you going to go? So he goes forward, and this coordinates, that's the threat on this square. What's the drawback? It undefends the center. So now it's not looking at the center, it's going for the king, and if the king is protected, the knight does not belong here. So what do we do? Well, we have to address the threat, even though the knight's trapped. We don't want to lose this pawn. Boom. Logical conclusion would be rook b7. This rook is good. Let's improve the other rook, which is staring into its own pawn, and remove all threats and coordination from the position. Makes perfect verbal sense. He takes, we have to take. Now this knight is hitting this pawn once. It's obviously impossible to coordinate a second time, which means his knight is simply trapped and doing nothing. I thought about going king g7, king g6, and just attacking the knight. I figured he would have to go, some desperate thing and passant, one way or the other. He retreats his knight. I figured maybe he can get out of it. I don't want to calculate too much. I have 6 minutes, and it's his turn. So right now my rook is threatening to come in. That would be really bad for him. So he makes a natural move, protecting, solidifying the center, but it takes time. It weakens the light squares a little, but it takes time, and that gives me the turn to do what I want. And so king g7 is still a consideration, improving the king here because he really has nothing to do. And I sat in this position for a little bit trying to figure out, like, what is the best move here? Because there's open C files, open A files, and he just closed this. So my rook is clearly better on one of these files, even if it gives up the e4 square, because that's defended multiple times. I said, okay, we can move our rook. What else can we do? Okay, we could jump our knight in, and since his knight is trapped, he's basically kind of forced to trade it off, and then we can take with the pawn, defended by the bishop, and we get we're up a piece, so we get a piece trade, and then we can get a pawn here. But then I said that gives him the turn, then he'll take the open file. What did I really accomplish? I'd rather use my turn to do something good for me, powerful for me. And now I want you to see something cool regarding free stuff. A lot of you will automatically go rook c8 or rook a8. And if you're below 1800, I will say that's a beautiful move. But if you're above 1800, I will say you need to consider nuances a little bit more. And so, for example, if you go rook c8 and he goes rook a8, it's your turn. You have the open file, he has the open file, and it's your turn. But consider this. Because this bishop's here, I took the pawn. Now, I was looking at every move not to take this pawn. I don't want to take this pawn. Like, I want to develop. I want to do something better. I want to do something more active. The last thing I want to do is take this ridiculous doubled isolated pawn that's not going anywhere. I didn't want to spend my move on that. So how did I end up doing it? Well, at first I decided, sure, rook to the open file looks like the most powerful move. King up looks like an extremely good improving move. But what if he goes b5? Yeah, the pawn is still going to be lost at some point or another, but not with my dark square bishop in one turn. I may have to do some rerouting or some type of rook thing. It may not happen now. It may happen 20 moves down in the endgame. But the deciding factor for me was I knew his only possibilities was to put his rook here. Like, what else can white do in this position? His bishop is being ketoed. His knight is stuck. Pawn pushes don't do anything. He has to go to an open file. But whichever open file he goes to, like, for example, if I go here and he goes here, it's my turn. But if I take the pawn and he goes here, because of my bishop, I can challenge whichever file he goes to. So if he went to C, I go to C. And he's not going to want to trade, so he's going to immediately go to the other file, right? So now he's on this, and if he went to C first, it would be vice versa. But the point is, I have the open file, he has the open file, it's our turn, and we got that pawn, right? If you just took the open file immediately and he took the other open file, you would have the exact same position, but you don't have the pawn. And so you're completely missing out on free stuff. This is only possible because the bishop forces him to go to the opposite, because there's no way he's going to trade. Slightly complicated in advance, but hopefully you followed that. So anyway, what happened? He goes here, I take the pawn, and what do you know? Open file. I told you, whichever one he goes to, I'm challenging it, and he'll have to go to the other one, but he doesn't. He takes. I was not expecting that because I'm up a piece. why would you trade your rook? You're just gonna lose, right? But he traded, so I'd take it, whatever. And I know he did that because this was his own, like, in this position, if he just moves, he still can't do anything. Like, there's still nothing to do. So his only idea in the position is his pawn break e4, and this whole time he cannot play e4 because it's been covered 3 times. So he takes the rook to deflect my bishop so that now he can play e4 without losing the pawn. So I figure, okay, he plays e4. If he has another move, what's the threat? Maybe he even pushes e5. You don't let him do that. We just take the pawn. You could take it either way. Who really cares? It's going to force a knight trade or a bishop. It's going to force a piece trade because his knight's stuck. And when we take with the knight, his knight's under attack. So I thought he's going to automatically trade the knight and get it out of dodge, keep the bishop. But he does not do that. He takes with the bishop, which surprised me. I understand he wants the knight so that he can fight against the dark squares as well. If you just keep the left square bishop, you're just toast. It still surprised me though. I was still expecting the other way. I take, he takes, because the knight can fight on dark squares, but it cannot fight against the bishop, like the bishop pair. So here there's a million ways to convert. But I'm at 4 minutes and I start panicking. And I say, okay, let me just keep it simple. You know, yes, you can improve your king or this or that or push a pawn maybe, like, but there's always consequences and I don't want to deal with that. So I'm just going to dominate the knight by going bishop e7, controlling every single square it can jump to, forward with the forward jumps. And now I'm not afraid of his knight, and now I can casually bring my king or my bishop or do whatever. And before I did this, I calculated, and I had to calculate d5 with the intention of d6. And I said, okay, if I go d5, how do I stop d6? You can't court, you can't bring your king there, this bishop doesn't help. But I said, oh, I have a response. He goes d5, the intention of kicking me. I just counter with f5. Now his knight can't support the square anymore. If he pushes, I'll gladly trade and then take this pawn. So he has to move his knight. But now his knight is garbage. Can't do anything. No threats. You could do whatever you want here. I converted by saying, okay, this will just cover the square for a second. This is now, let me just improve this bishop and tie down his knight. So now if he ever moves the pawn, he loses it. If he ever moves the knight, he loses it. So I'm just tying him down, right? He just makes random pawn moves. I'm going to ignore it. Why? Well, I'm threatening this pawn. How do I win it? Now I just take the knight, which is defending the pawn. He can't do anything about this. So he moves his king closer. I take the knight. That nets me the pawn. This is completely winning. You guys should not have a problem converting something like this. White has 0 counterplay, 0 defensive resources other than you blundering stalemate. And you should be able to win this against Magnus Carlsen every time. So here's how you convert. You're up a bishop, so all you need to do is bring your king closer. So he comes close to the center. We come close. He comes close, attacks our bishop. We come close, defend our bishop. Now notice, because white doesn't have a piece, all he has are pawns and kings. That means you can only move pawns or kings, but every time you move a pawn, it has serious consequences. So in this case, he would just lose the pawns, so that doesn't make sense. I mean, he can push this one now, but I'll just move out of the way, and if he pushes again, he'll blunder it. So he basically is going to have only king moves to make because he doesn't have other pieces. Whereas I have a bishop. What does that mean? Potential for... Wrong arm. How do I not know which arm is tattooed? Zugzwang. So he pushes the pawn. This attacks the bishop. You can literally move it anywhere you want, and you're fine on this diagonal. I just pick a random defended square. Does not matter. His king can't go anywhere. He can't push pawns. Notice he can push this, which is a trade. But then you walk your king. You literally walk your king here. You don't have to go on the edge, but you know what I mean. But you don't even do that. If he pushes, you push past. I don't know why I said take, but you definitely push past. Because he's again in zugzwang. He's going to have to move his king because everything else hangs stuff. And then when he moves his king, you move your king in. That's just way more winning. Because if you do this, it's winning, which now you have to like go around. It's a pain in the butt. Takes a lot of turns. So anyway, he just moves his king back because he has nothing to do. And now I have all the time in the world to get my king in. So I get closer. He tries to stop me. But guess what? I don't have to move my king. I make a random bishop move. He has to move his king. That's called zugzwang. And now I'm in here. And then he goes and protects it. And I give him this check, which nets the pawn, and he resigns. Beautiful game. Kind of rough. These early c5 lines against the London can be very tricky. But as you saw, we kind of got a grip on the center here and held on to it for the rest of the game. And that's what it takes to take down a 2000. Jeez, it's a lot of work. Alright guys, the video is too long. Good luck in your chess. Goodbye.